Hey folks, it's John Krask with Everlibrary, the Everlibrary Institute. Thank you for being part of another conversation around the Political Librarian, our journal of public policy, tax policy, and education policy here at the Everlibrary Institute. We are meeting every Monday in January, February, and the beginning of March 2026 to have conversations around the special issue of the Political Librarian that we put out at the end of 2025. It was a special issue. We had two of them this past year, really largely in response to what the hell's going on in America. That is my unofficial title of it. Our editors, Dr. Nicole Cook and Dr. Aisha Johnson, have a much more dignified title for the issue. We're trying to talk through out loud in real time what's happening in the library sector, what's happening to libraries and librarians, what's happening to our readers, to our users, whether it's academic library, public library, school library, and really the professional librarianship. I'm very thrilled today to be able to share with you a conversation with two of our colleagues, Travis Wagner, Travis I'm going to bring in, and Evan Allgood, who are the authors of, and I'll put it up on screen here, one of the articles in the special issue, What is Lost in Restoring Truth and Sanity, which is one of the Trump executive orders. And we're going to spend some time talking about the president today. Queer approaches to absence, silence, and erasure in archival descriptions. Thank you both for being here today so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We're excited to chat.
Absolutely. I'm going to put up the link so that everybody can follow along in real time at thepoliticallibrarian.org. Evan, you are a doctoral student, School of Information Sciences, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which is also where I went to college 150 million years ago. Though I was in the theater program, I wasn't in the LIS program. And then Travis, assistant professor, School of Information Sciences, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. The bite that you wanted to take out of the discourse in this article, you're sitting at a place that is at the intellectual and political core of the special issue, the Trump administration's 2025 executive orders. And this one particularly around restoring truth and sanity to American history that has directly targeted LGBTQIA plus professionals, as well as the erasure of the stories, the truths. I mean, how do we teach history, whose history, in memory spaces and archival collections? And you've done some very good things, I think, around pairing interview research and archival survey data to get to this understanding of what acts of erasure are happening in real time within these federal memory institutions. I'm very interested, Evan, from your perspective as the lead author on this, what brought you to this topic, why this research, why now? And I appreciate you thinking of Everlibrary Institute as a publishing partner too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of what instigated us wanting to write this article is that, so part of the research that you mentioned, the sort of survey research, comes from my Master's of Library Science thesis. And then Travis and I were also doing some additional work talking to archival practitioners about the ways that they are sort of moving through describing LGBTQ history. And that in and of itself is already complicated. And then on top of that, we have executive orders coming from the White House, like the Restoring Truth and Sanity one. And I think at least, I don't want to speak for Travis, was sort of watching these come down, and I was getting really frustrated with the fact that it seemed like what this current administration thought that sort of made up history was just like a couple of pieces of paper and a little bit of description in a very specific subset of archives, and it drove me nuts. And I really wanted to write something about it that sort of shows the really fantastic work that archivists already do that I don't personally think that the White House can do. And that's sort of what we want this article to sort of express, is a little bit of a love letter to the kind of work that archivists have already been doing, especially around LGBTQ related history and other sorts of marginalized histories in particular. But we wanted to zero in on one space, especially given that there are also lots of other executive orders also coming down that are very anti-queer focused. So that's sort of where we were coming from it from. But Travis, if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, Travis, the frame of the article is that your research, I think, reframes that what preservation can mean in a political climate where censorship is a state-sponsored activity.
Mm-hmm. That's precisely right. And what I think was implicit in wanting to do this, this was data we had sort of collected in anticipation of what was going to come out of some of these executive orders, right? Data collection, in fact, for the interview portion started before we knew that Trump was going to be president again, because some of the concerns we felt important to ask were likely already happening or have historically happened to this community, right? So what I sort of thought was important here is, like, I bet archivists are already going to be thinking about what could happen and already be doing work to prepare for this. And that's in part because the Trump administration isn't the first administration to erase from government records queer existence, right? We know that the Reagan administration did this during the HIV and AIDS epidemic, but we also know at a sort of state level that this has happened in particular ways. So what that data allowed us to show is that in states that have historically been hostile to this sort of work, folks have already created protocols and practices to make sure that this data isn't easily discoverable and removable, both at the sort of request of members of this community, but because, again, state orders have already attempted to do this, right? So I think that's really what we sort of wanted to pull out. The other thing that I would highlight particularly now, and this is really sort of Evan's particular work, because this came out of other master's thesis as well, is that, of course, when we talk about queer erasure, it isn't the only sort of like identity or grouping that this archival work is doing, right? Some of what we talk about is, like, if we look at the South as a context where some of these archives exist, that is also combated and contested as well, right? So understanding that queer erasure is never just about that thing, but all of these other identities and groupings as well.
Well, part of so two things I want to help our listeners and our watchers as they start to engage with your work. One is I'd like to get your take on restoring truth and sanity to American history as an executive order, and if you can do a little bit of critical, a little crit lit on it, and talk about why. Okay, for me, it sounds like the most doublespeak approach possible out of the federal government. But I'd like to get your thoughts on it. The other thing I want to touch on too is that you were not just looking at the South. I mean, what Stonewall as a moment in time in the article, the Stonewall National Monument, the Smithsonian, these are happening. These acts of erasure are happening across America's very diverse geography. So, but first, take me through the executive order a little bit. And, where are these trigger points that are now becoming part of federal policy?
Yeah, I think to the point of this particular executive order, I think we were looking at it, but also it in the context of a handful of other executive orders, including ones that are sort of intentionally focused on removing DEI, especially from like higher academia, but also sort of broadly across the government, across the United States. And then also the, I might put these words in the wrong order, but something along the lines of defending women from something gender ideology. Apologies, I can't remember the whole title. It's quite long, but essentially,
That one is I think it's 14286, if I remember correctly, because it's currently being applied in Tennessee to the collections of all the public libraries in the state.
Yes, which is a really great thing to bring up, I think, is that like all of these executive orders are kind of moving together in unison to essentially, in my view, try and create a set of truths, quote unquote, about American history broadly, and the kinds of American history that we are able to tell. So in the Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History executive order specifically, they talk about attempting to correct historical revision that describes the United States legacy as inherently racist, sexist, oppressive, or otherwise irredeemably flawed. Essentially, there is one specific narrative that they would like American history to tell. And in another executive order that is sort of focused on K through 12 education, they talk about specifically patriotic education. And I think the goal is sort of to bring that K through 12 and then also in our sort of government institutions that are trying to sort of talk about it and foster ideas around American history. The thing that particularly bothers me about this, amongst the many things that bother me about this, is the idea that there is one singular history when history is made up of so many people and so many experiences. So one, I think that this is simply an impossible endeavor that they are trying to pursue. And two, just like sort of fundamentally misunderstands A, history, and B, archival practice.
Mm-hmm. Travis, to that point, what does it mean really for federal archives, not the profession, of course, but the institutions, to be told to comply with a set of government directives that are intended to rewrite identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always tricky and always reactionary. So, I mean, we get into this in part in the article, but I'll sort of give my sort of off-the-cuff response in the ways that are and are not in that. I think what is partially being responded to here is indicative of archival description, but just indicative of cultural shifts in language use, right? So what these executive orders often sort of ask is like the explicit removal of named identities from these records. I mean, we see this both, John, you alluded earlier to the Stonewall, the removal of transgender from the Stonewall Monument, but then we see the sort of inversion of this where like Enola Gay records are removed from things because gay is in the title, right? So it's the idea that the language is being circulated and explicitly used. And I think, you know, that is an attempt to control a public-facing record that is, in many ways, foolish about how publicly this language is circulated, right? If I go to queer affirming social media spaces, this language is being used and made visible. Not to say that there aren't like parallel content moderation practices happening by companies that want to also regulate this. So there's that element to it, and I think this ties to practices by the government to hide those, because then they might make an argument that history aid doesn't exist, but also it doesn't expose it to people who might learn from that history, or God forbid find themselves aligned with that history as well, right? So, you know, Tennessee is an example of this, where it's really sort of hitting not just government institutions, but their role in educational curricula as well, right? So these terms, these tools that might be used to educate can't come into classrooms or other spaces where one might be informed with it. So I think it's a little bit of a mixture of those types of things.
Yeah, Evan, to that end, there's real danger for the communities that are represented in these archives, because data visibility, as you discussed in the article, when the state or the federal government demands data visibility from and about a community that needs sometimes to have invisibility in order to survive. I mean, we're moving into a space where it's not acts of censorship, and it's not just acts of discrimination. It's perhaps a precursor to persecution.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that it's extremely important to be able to find ideally representations of yourself in history, but even just like people in history that you feel that you can relate to, because I really strongly believe that if you can see yourself sort of surviving and existing and thriving in the past, it gives you the ability to do that in the future, right? And that's particularly why I think LGBTQ history and archival materials in particular are so powerful and impactful. And I think that is also in part why the government wants to remove them, which is heartbreaking and frustrating. Mm-hmm. But that's to say, yeah, I do believe that one of the sort of first steps to attempting to remove a people is attempting to remove their history. Yeah, that's a bummer, but true.
I'm with you. So you also write, Evan, about queer archival silence, and the idea in the article about queer archival silence. Oftentimes we talk about silence equals erasure, but the absence is sometimes an intentional safety strategy. Can you talk through that a little bit more for folks?
Absolutely. So what you sort of just said sort of reminds me of like the AIDS slogan of silence equals death, right? Which feels very, very clearly like if you don't talk about something, then people will not know, and then people will die, which was very significantly true in that moment, and continues to be true about a lot of different political things in this moment. And at the same time, one of our participants, actually a handful of participants, but one of the participants that we quoted in the article brings up the idea that maybe somebody was not out in their lifetime, but they write in their diary or something, like their personal papers about being queer in some capacity, but they were not sort of publicly out and they're a public figure. Is it the archivist's decision to sort of make that information public, or should we have left it to the individual whose materials these are to begin with? And sometimes the like right thing to do is to trust the person whose papers you have. And we talk a decent amount in the paper about if donors are alive, that's fantastic. You can go talk to them and ask them how they want to be represented. They are the experts on their own lives, and they are the experts on what they have done in that life and the way that they want to be described. And sometimes the way that people want to be described is not identity forward, and that is absolutely a valid way to move through the world and move through life and have yourself represented in the archive. Sometimes those silences are also a product of attempting to protect oneself from discrimination, and at the time that papers were being created, maybe there was a certain kind of persecution that was happening that this person didn't want to have anything written about themselves in that way, and therefore, and now they have passed, and these are the materials that we have. We can't talk to them anymore. We can't talk to ghosts. So this is sort of where we are. And I think one of the main arguments that we are sort of making in this paper as well is just trusting records creators and trusting donors to be able to describe themselves the way that they need to, which sometimes means that there are intentional silences in the archive, and that's okay. That's part of it.
So, Travis, I want to come back to you in a moment. I got one more question for Evan. When I come back to you, Travis, I want to talk a little bit about what LIS education should be doing to respond to these risks, in training future archivists in particular. But Evan, I want to just dive into this a little bit more, because it's not just about the donors and the subjects and the institutions. It's about the workforce. And queer memory workers right now are facing an unprecedented level of either scrutiny or I mean, I know people who've left the profession because the environment is hostile. Sounds polite when it's that toxic. What are the real world implications for the workforce?
It is scary. Like, you are absolutely right that is something that is happening, and that is heartbreaking that it's happening. If we don't have people in the archival profession who are sort of keeping an eye out for minoritized histories or intentionally suppressed histories, then those histories aren't going to make it into the archive. One of the things that we get to bring up in this article is the ways that different queer archivists have sort of been showing up for the papers and materials and records of the queer individuals who either have happened to show up in their archives. One of my favorite quotes that I feel lucky that I got to snatch for this paper was the quote about there just being a box labeled gay in the back of the archive, right? Yeah. And that archivist got to be like, that's unreasonable, and I get to fix it because I see this and I recognize myself in these materials, and I'm going to make them visible because they deserve that visibility. And clearly there was an archivist beforehand who either didn't care or just simply didn't have time. Like, everyone has a backlog. That's just the way archives work. But when you sort of see yourself in materials, I think Marika C4 does a really great job of sort of talking about this amongst lots of other fantastic archival thinkers, but talking about that sort of affective experience can be really important both to the archivists themselves, to the person who's processing those materials, and to researchers when they sort of come across the finding aid or the other sorts of description that you're able to provide. So that's essentially all to say. I think that it's extraordinarily important to make sure that there are still queer folks in this profession, because I believe, lose a lot of history when you sort of you might not be recognizing things. Maybe there are terms that you would only know because you are also queer yourself, or those kinds of things. It's important to have people who can see that.
Yeah. Travis, to that to that LIS education question I wanted to prep you for. It's been a year, almost to the day, since the beginnings of these executive orders that are so focused. You have people in your program right now at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign who've started their LIS journey, their archives journey, their museum journey before those were issued. They're in class right now. They're about to graduate. How does our sector, the educators in our sector, respond to these risks?
Yeah, I've sort of watched this happen actively in classrooms. So this is unfortunately a really wonderful question to ask right now. And I think I'll sort of respond first by, there's that sort of adage that comes in, and it's like almost like a running joke in archives now, where it's like, well, why don't we digitize everything, right? And everyone who works in archives knows that that's not an infrastructurally sound approach, right? But I think the question now is like, well, if we have it, why don't we make it available? And I think what the emphasis and shift I've been trying to prepare students for is like, archives, yes, is about collecting materials, but your work is to curate them across a lot of different social and ethical landscapes. So rather than, highlighting, which we do because our participants talk about it, they're useful tools like the Homosaurus that have emerged to help us in as best as possible in a community affirmed way describe these materials. But we can learn those tools, but at the end of the day, we are in a historical moment where, as our participant said, you may not make this description visible, and it's okay for you to do that. There's a lot of political, personal, institutional reasons you might do that. So I find myself in the educational role shifting from what I used to do to be like, well, your job is to make these things visible and accessible. Your job might not be to do that anymore, but you can still curate and make these things sort of preserved and not necessarily accessible. Unfortunately, then we can fall on other paradigms of archival practice and digital curation practice where policy can be your friend here and say, we've created X, Y, or Z rule that makes these not available for research, right? And I think part of that can be not for access and use, and therefore it's not searchable, and you can't control find terms to then justify their removal, right? So it's in some ways what was ideal about archives, right? Is like you can think both about the past, but really think about the future use of these materials in new ways, or go analog in ways that you might not have done so in the past.
That's very interesting. I mean, the analog as a means of limiting access in a certain respect. Evan, let me wrap up with you today on this. I think about that box that you mentioned. The box that has the word "gay" on it, and you're very generous potentially by saying that was just a benign, overworked archivist. It also could be something, as you said, which is that they were looking to shove it in the back corner and never deal. Is your thesis with this article and what we're talking about really one of resistance and activism, or is it one of professional responsibility?
Excuse me. I think those two things are sort of inextricably intertwined. I think that part of the responsibility of being an archivist is that you get to steward these materials. You're not necessarily sort of in control of them or in charge of them, and that's in like that sort of specific aspect. But you are the person who is here to make history accessible to researchers now and researchers in the future. And I think part of that work is sort of pushing against when people are trying to encroach on the archive the way that this administration currently is, and trying to very intentionally and explicitly remove certain histories. I think it is absolutely worth fighting for, and I think it is, in my opinion, is part of one's job. I truly feel that those two things are inextricably intertwined, at least for myself.
I really appreciate you sharing that perspective, Evan. And Travis, thank you for this today as well. I want to make sure that everybody sees the full title again and comes back to thepoliticallibrarian.org to have a conversation, to learn more from you and to have a conversation with you about this very important topic. I think that there's something to be said for that resistance conversation being deeply integrated into how we do our work, and that the work is much more thoughtful now than it has ever, not to say it's ever had to have been, but it has to be thoughtful again in ways that, gosh, I mean, I'm looking forward to the next couple of 100 days here, that's for sure. So thank you both so much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Absolutely. And folks, this broadcast today is immediately on demand, available either on Every Library's YouTube or Every Library's Facebook. We are having, again, Mondays from January 26th, January 19th, all the way through March 2nd, Mondays, 1 o'clock Eastern, more of these conversations. Please join us for future ones. Share the archive of these views, and engage with Evan and Travis on these big conversations. So, all right, team, we always give a little wave here, and I put up the banner. Thanks again.